Hiroshima, 1945. The destructive power of the atom brings about the end of an empire and vaults the world into the nuclear age. The carnage unleashed by the new weapon will completely alter the way America views its military priorities. Soon, the carriers that brought the war to Japan's doorstep return their crews home. But even as they pull into American harbors, the vessels that bore the struggle are being shunted to the past. To many in power, the age of the nuclear bomb has made the aircraft carrier a relic, just as the carrier had done to the battleship before it. But these are matters of little concern to the men come home to a nation intent on enjoying a peaceful and secure future purchased through 4 bloody years of hardship. In Europe, they look to an uncertain future and begin the long climb from Armageddon. Japan, too, lies in ruin. In despair, the former Axis powers and the nations they victimized look to the United States for salvation. America's answer is the $17 billion Marshall Plan. The failure of the Versailles Treaty following World War I is a potent lesson not lost on the leaders in Washington. In hopes of establishing political stability in Europe and Asia, aid pours overseas, the tab to be paid in part by money saved from drastic cuts in the nation's military. Secretary of State George C. Marshall.
This is certainly not the program of a country seeking to exercise domination or to influence unduly any foreign country. The nations and political groups which have now declared their opposition to the program apparently wish to block for their own reasons the revival of Western Europe. Whether we like it or not, we find ourselves, our nation, in a world position of vast responsibility. We can act for our own good by acting for the world's good.
By 1946, a one-time ally has become the new adversary, the only nation that poses a serious challenge to American global hegemony. The Marshall Plan is seen as the key to averting Soviet communist encroachment beyond what are already considered the lost regions of Eastern Europe. In the face of massive defense cutbacks, one service emerges fairly unscathed, the Army Air Corps. By 1947, it becomes an independent branch of the armed services and takes on a title appropriate to its newfound stature. As the holder of the nuclear grail, the Air Force will receive the lion's share of new funding. It was, after all, the Air Force that brought Nazi Germany to its knees, and the Air Force that delivered the nuclear blow to Japan, ending the war. Within the decade, this new branch will become the largest enterprise in the United States with over $70 billion worth of assets.
The long-awaited unification of the armed services comes a step nearer as top-ranking officials agree on a plan.
To cut costs, the armed forces are streamlined under the new office of the Secretary of Defense. Army and Air Force band together in support of the Truman administration plan. The Navy, led by Navy Secretary James Forrestal, is less than enthusiastic and voices vehement opposition. At the heart of the debate lies the downsizing of the carrier fleet and the transfer of much of its airborne capability to the Air Force. According to the other services, the age of the carrier is dead. These massive floating airstrips will be sitting ducks in the nuclear era. Sentiments such as these, along with the government's new frugality, brings about a halt to the construction of the Navy's newest carrier, the USS United States. Furious, the Naval High Command readies itself for a war of self-preservation. The Navy, intent on proving the critics wrong, is ready to show just how well a carrier fleet will fare in the face of nuclear attack. At a distant atoll in the Pacific called Bikini Island, they prepare a derelict fleet for the ultimate test. The Navy brass, among them Secretary Forrestal, are escorted through the vessels moored in Bikini Bay. Ships that once sailed with the mightiest navy in the world are manned by livestock in this, their final mission. "7 miles offshore, hundreds of men, admirals and stewards alike, wait for the drop. The warhead itself is identical to the one that leveled Nagasaki. Most assume that the damage will be severe but not complete. Survivability is the goal. At the center of the fleet lies the aircraft carrier Saratoga, grand old fighting lady of the Pacific. Within seconds, an entire naval fleet is demolished. Those vessels left afloat are coated with radioactive spray. To the politicians holding the purse strings, the equation is simple enough. One bomb, one bomber, and an entire naval fleet lost. And not realizing that the future of the carrier lies in its ability to provide the nation with a means of flexible response, the Navy plays right into the Air Force argument. Only hours after the blast, with hull collapsed, the Saratoga sinks to the bottom. Funding becomes scarce, yet at their Bethpage, Long Island plant, Grumman Aircraft pushes ahead with its first entry into the jet age. A carrier-based plane that represents the Navy's ground attack aircraft of the future. Originally conceived as a two-seat night fighter, the initial design, the XF-9F1 doesn't get much further than the drawing board due to problems with its four-engine arrangement. But in August of 1946, when Grumman formally presents a new single-engine design to the Navy, it marks the beginning of a production run that will continue for more than a decade. Like its Grumman predecessors, the XF-9F2 quickly takes on the name of a big cat. But over time, it becomes clear that the Panther, as it is called, carries much more than just a company nickname.
Maybe they wouldn't go quite as high nor quite as fast because they were built a little heavier. But it meant then when you got hit by anti-aircraft fire that they would take more punishment than other airplanes. That's the reputation they had anyway. Now, of course, in modern days now, Grumman has made some of the highest and fastest aircraft that there are in existence.
The Panther is just the latest in a line of stalwarts that included the Hellcat, the backbone of the American carrier force that crushed Japan. The Hellcat's legacy as a rugged ground attack weapon marks a path that later Grumman planes like the Panther will follow.
We lovingly called Grumman aircraft the Grumman Iron Works, because their airplanes were so good. They had a few that weren't too great, but generally speaking, most of them you couldn't tear apart.
For most pilots, flying a Grumman plane from carrier to combat and back conjures up one word: survivability. In November of 1947, the F-9F2 is rolled out at the Bethpage plant test facility for its first flight. The plane's nose is engineered with sliding rails for easy access to its four 20mm nose cannon. With a pressurized air-conditioned cockpit, ejection seat, radio direction finder, and quick-release bubble canopy, The Panther is truly state-of-the-art. From the beginning, the plane displays the great handling characteristics that will one day make it the aircraft of choice for the Navy's Blue Angel flying team.
You could pull 8, 10 Gs, and the bird would still be ready to fly the next day. I don't think I ever saw a wrinkle in a Panther jet. If you pulled too many G's in the average airplane, the skin's going to wrinkle somewhere, but not in the Panther jet.
The Panther's top speed is about 530 miles an hour at 20,000 feet. But like many early American jets, finding the power plant to reach that speed is no easy task. After struggling with a 4-engine configuration and then an underpowered Westinghouse J-30, Grumman eventually looks across the Atlantic to the Rolls-Royce Company's Neen turbojet. This engine, too, is based on the Neen. But the engineers are neither British nor American. They're Russians working on imported Neen engines, around which they'll soon build the Soviet Union's premier jet fighter of the early 1950s, the MiG-15. Soon, both MiG and Panther will become reacquainted in the skies over a distant Asian peninsula. The jet era poses many new challenges, and nowhere is this more true than in the realm of American naval aviation. Since new carriers aren't being constructed to accommodate modern aircraft, vintage vessels are refitted instead. Jet weights and landing speeds demand much sturdier carrier decks, so those still in service are strengthened and reinforced. By the late 40s, Panthers are in operation throughout the fleet. A fleet whose survival is more endangered by domestic politics than any foreign threat. In Pentagon deliberations, the Air Force lobbies for the outright elimination of all large carrier groups. Ironically, in spite of the turmoil of the time, Grumman's F-9 has become the backbone of the most modern seaborne Air Force the world has ever seen. Far to the east, events are accelerating the global antagonisms that will soon put the Panther's capability to test. In June 1948, the Soviet Union shuts off West Berlin from the rest of the free world. What follows are 12 months of tension in which an unyielding America refuses to let the isolated city fall into the Soviet sphere. That same year, tension gives way to fear and paranoia when the Soviets first exhibit their new long-range bomber, the Tupolev Tu-4 Bull, and then set the whole of the Western world on edge. By September of 1949, America's nuclear monopoly is no more.
America prepares to face attack on its cities and industrial centers under a combined civilian defense program. Any community is vulnerable to possible bombing, including the final threat of the devastating atom.
For the first time, the USSR possesses not only the destructive power of the atom, but the ability to deliver it to every major American city. Panic reverberates down the American spine and sends the nation reeling. That same year in China, Mao Zedong's revolutionary forces bring a fourth of the world's population under the Red Banner. With the external communist threat spinning out of control, the nation turns its anger inward. The election of '48 is a vicious one. Truman faces charges of being soft on communism. His opponent, Thomas Dewey, plays on these charges for every bit of political capital they're worth.
And what are we going to do about the communists here in our midst? Some people jeer at the problem, calling it a red herring. Some people get panicky about it. I don't belong to either of those groups. We must neither ignore the communists nor outlaw them. If we ignore them, we give them the cloak of immunity that they want. If we outlaw them, we give them the martyrdom that they want even more. We will, in the government we get next January, we will keep informed and we'll keep the American people informed where they are, who they are, and what they're up to. And if they or anybody else if they break our laws against treason, they'll get a traitor's treatment.
As fear of Soviet nuclear power grows, faith in traditional military priorities lessens or becomes skewed. Because of this, by 1949, the Air Force has largely won the inter-service battle. And in spite of known vulnerability to interception, its B-36 long-range bomber receives massive funding. Despite bitter protest by Secretary Forrestal and others, congressional leaders begin debating cuts in naval aviation as deep as 60%. Thinking of the Day states that the bomber's long-range atomic strike capability makes naval carrier task forces redundant. Within months, the inter-service rivalry takes its first casualty. Asked to resign as Secretary of Defense, a depressed and exhausted James Forrestal takes his own life on what would be the eve of his vindication. On June 25, 1950, in the backwaters of Korea, Northern dictator Kim Il-sung launches his invasion to reunify the nation by force of arms. He has tacit approval from both Moscow and Beijing. Recent pronouncements from Washington staking out the regions America considers vital exclude South Korea. It is a tragic oversight. Leaders in both Russia and China don't really expect the U.S. to intervene. The attack is savage and sudden. Within 2 days, Seoul falls as communist troops barrel southward on the heels of a rapidly collapsing South Korean army. But America's reaction is swift and decisive. With UN approval, U.S. troops from the occupation forces in Japan are rushed to Korea, many in transports still coated with coal dust from the Berlin airlift. Most anticipate an easy victory against a primitive foe. But peacetime occupation duty in Japan has left the Americans soft, poorly trained, and prey to ludicrous equipment shortfalls. The first unit into battle is codenamed Task Force Smith. It's a pretentious title for a single battalion of green enlistees. The men they face are well-equipped, intensely motivated, and highly trained. In the face of this onslaught, beleaguered GIs wait for salvation from above that just isn't there. South Korean and U.S. troops alike collapse into the southern tip of the Korean peninsula. There they barely hold on to their last parcel of Korean soil, the Pusan perimeter. Every day the perimeter shrinks as North Koreans using Soviet tanks roll over the scattered American units. Because of defense cutbacks in recent years, most have only World War II-era bazookas to defend themselves with, and these are totally ineffective. Most immediate air support comes in the form of F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets flying from Japan. But because of fuel constraints imposed by the long journey to Korean airspace, they can loiter over the battle zone for only a brief 15 minutes before heading home. Carriers speed to Korea. Aboard them, F-9F Panthers about to see action for the very first time. Never before have carrier jets been launched into combat. Unlike their Air Force counterparts, Navy Panthers provide sustained cover to the desperate UN troops below. Flying as many as 4 missions a day, some nearly 2 hours long, Panther pilots work around the clock to stem the North Korean tide. At home, a severely depleted U.S. military staggers to gear up for war. Carriers long since mothballed are pulled back into service along with the planes that will fill their decks. Most of these are older prop-driven aircraft and represent an American military with only 1 foot yet in the jet age. At the same time, both Navy and Marines comb the nation for the pilots to fly them. Many veteran flyers from World War II are called back to service after having settled in civilian life. Some, like baseball's Ted Williams, are thrown into Panther cockpits after only limited training.
He really wasn't well trained as a pilot. We trained him to fly weather in Korea in combat. But of course, we were always watching, being very careful. And Ted would have been an exceptionally good pilot had we had longer period to work with him.
Those called back have precious few jet hours and little recent flying behind them. This rush to put older pilots into jet plane cockpits and then into the daily routine of making multiple carrier landings often stretches prudence and safety beyond reasonable limits. After accelerated carrier qualification on land strips, they move all too quickly to the real thing.
414, 50 left turn, intercept final bearing, 305. Take check.
But over time, carrier launch procedure is honed to a fine craft. First, the plane handlers align the Panther on the catapult. The section leader on the port cat, his wingman on the starboard. Then, wound up to full power, the pilot stiff arms the stick with his right hand and the throttle with his left. Then a final salute to signal, "Let the cat fly." As always, during launch operations, the newly arrived helicopter hovers close by in the event of plane and pilot going into the drink. The Panther's tricycle landing gear means that it squats in a tail-low position. And at full throttle for a prolonged period, the plane has a nasty tendency to burn the caulking between the planks of the flight deck. The solution comes in the form of retractable blast boards that deflect exhaust and enable plane handlers to pass within 3 feet behind them. Upon launch, Panthers pack nearly 6,400 pounds of ordnance and fuel onto their 9,300-pound frames. This includes up to 1,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs, 760 rounds of 20-millimeter cannon shells, and over 920 gallons of fuel. With a range of nearly 1,200 miles, there is no point on the Korean peninsula immune from attack. And with a stall speed of just 78 knots, they deliver their payloads with astounding accuracy. Diving onto target, Panthers employ brakes to smooth their descent. clearly visible here on the fuselage underside, beneath the canopy.
We were the heavy haulers out there, and that we're doing a lot of close air work up in front of the 1st Marine Division and in front of the Army divisions also. We did napalm. We used high-velocity aircraft rockets doing early morning road recce's way up where you'd go up in the, way up as we called it, way up in Indian country at that time, way up north, and drop down at first light in the morning and come down along the roads trying to pick up trucks or trains that hadn't gotten in yet. We used the airplane for a lot of purposes out there. We used it on, I guess, more close air support than anything else. We worked in very, very close in front of our own troops, and that's very exacting work.
To maintain this intensity of action, a flotilla of ships shadow each carrier with vast supplies. Each of these floating air bases needs replenishment about once every 3 days. But Panthers don't just fly from carriers offshore. Marines like John Glenn find themselves stationed in some of the many ground bases that spring up just behind the front lines. Conditions here are primitive, but the Panther's ease of maintenance proves well suited to the strain. Perilous in their own right, the runways, grated steel carpeting laid over bulldozed dirt, become dangerously pitted by the constant pounding of aircraft coming in. It isn't unusual for pilots to go through a set of tires after every mission. But with the arrival of General Douglas MacArthur, the harshness of the land and defeat on the battlefield soon give way to dimmed hope. One of MacArthur's first steps is to initiate a strategic bombing campaign designed to, as he says, flatten every village, town, and city north of the 38th parallel. On June 30th, he issues orders making all of Korean airspace a free-fire area. B-29s flying from Okinawa begin their 3-year effort to destroy the communists' ability to move men and supplies. But American bomber crews are trained to operate in big formations, and soon there are pitifully few targets left in the north to justify this kind of attack. In August 1950, B-29 staged the biggest carpet bombing raid since Operation Cobra in Normandy. Over 3,200 500-pound bombs are dropped in a 3 by 7 mile area where a large North Korean troop concentration has supposedly encamped. Intelligence photos later reveal there are no enemy troops even there. One B-29 chases a single North Korean soldier on a motorcycle down a road until its bombs catch up with him. As early as 1942, air warfare strategist Alexander Seversky wrote, "Total war from the air against an undeveloped country is nigh futile. It is one of the curious features of the most modern weapon that it is especially effective against the most modern types of civilization. The Korean experience underscores this, because in the end, formation bombing will account for over 200,000 North Korean civilian deaths, while having only limited strategic effect on the battlefield itself. And although the enemy road network is effectively destroyed, the North Koreans' tenacious ability to move supplies at night or over land enable them to fight effectively throughout the conflict. On September 15, 1950 at Incheon Harbor, the fortunes of war undergo a dramatic reversal. In one bold move, MacArthur inserts an army behind the North Korean flank. Faced with encirclement, they disengage from their stranglehold on the Pusan perimeter and fall back. UN casualties during the invasion are incredibly light, 22 killed. It is the greatest American victory of the struggle and sets the North Korean army on its heels. The U.S. landings at Incheon are MacArthur's shining moment. Haunted by memories of the debacle at Anzio, many in Washington had been reluctant to take the risk. But victory is total, and MacArthur basks in it. As UN forces liberate the captured areas around Seoul, they discover shocking evidence of the brutal nature of North Korean occupation. Thousands of UN prisoners of war bound and shot. Many more South Korean civilians, deemed unsympathetic by their communist overlords, murdered and buried in shallow mass graves. The Southerners quickly re-established themselves, led by Korean President Syngman Rhee. But in reality, although freer than the North, South Korea too is autocratic and Rhee himself a dictator. And as Seoul is reoccupied, thousands of citizens suspected of communist sympathies, or simply in Rhee's way, are marched off to summary imprisonment and execution. The push north is reminiscent of Patton's blitz through France. Enemy opposition disintegrates in the face of hard-charging UN forces. Within a month, the 38th parallel is left behind and the enemy capital, Pyongyang, falls. A massive airborne drop blocks the fleeing remnants of Kim's army. And when UN ground forces meet up with these paratroopers, victory seems near at hand. MacArthur, at first intent on simply destroying the North Korean ability to wage war, begins to harbor greater ambition. The speed and ease of victory tempt the general and many in Washington to ponder a reunited Korea firmly encamped in the Western sphere. But as UN forces press ever northward, appearing among the many prisoners taken are sporadic numbers of what appear to be Chinese regulars. Incredibly, the High Command dismisses their presence as unimportant. With the sudden turn of events, Truman and MacArthur meet at Wake Island to discuss closing strategy. When asked about the Chinese troops rumored to be massing across the Yalu River, MacArthur assures Truman that even if the Chinese do attack, American air power can readily destroy the bridges and forward Chinese bases imperative to a successful offensive. Truman directs his field commander not to push too far. Panthers, armed with aerial cameras, play a large part in gathering intelligence photos on both sides of the Yalu. Usually these unarmed Panthers are accompanied by a fighter escort. The Navy's first photo jets, they fly countless missions over hostile territory to assess the whereabouts and strength of enemy troop concentrations. But somehow the photos they bring back are misread or ignored. By the beginning of November 1950, the CIA itself estimates that nearly 40,000 Chinese troops are already in Korea. More incredibly, when shown evidence that reveals another 700,000 massed just across the border, MacArthur's command pays little heed. It is, after all, a peasant army, too lacking in training and heavy weapons to pose any real threat. November 1st, 1950. In the early morning hours, 250,000 Chinese troops swarm across the Korean border. All along the line, UN forces are overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the assault. For America, the Chinese invasion melds easily into the larger specter of the struggle against world communism. But to the leaders in Beijing, there is no such ideological convolution. The invasion is based on security priorities predating the birth of communism by 1,000 years. To this re-emerging Asian power, a huge Western army poised on the Manchurian border is simply unacceptable. Resistance crumbles before wave after human wave of enemy infantry. At the United Nations, condemnation from the South Korean representative is swift and direct.
I point my finger at these representatives of the Chinese communist regime, and I ask, why do they come here with unclean hands? I ask again, why does this group come here with hands that drip with blood, the blood of the United Nations troops the blood of the Korean people.
In Washington, leaders of the nation's 4 largest veterans groups petitioned Truman to use the bomb on North Korea. Some even urged large-scale bombing of select Chinese cities. Both options are considered by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Truman, in classic Cold War terminology, declares U.S. resolve to not let any more dominoes fall.
If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival. We have committed ourselves to the cause of a just and peaceful world order through the United Nations. We stand by that commitment.
If a bomb strikes, officials will be able to map the radius of the destruction. With the technical data at their disposal, they will direct civilian defense workers to the aid of those in peril or those who might have already suffered the all-out effects of an all-out enemy attack. Hospitals will place their facilities.
The American public fears this the prelude to World War III. The Soviets will certainly come to China's aid. In New York, thousands engage in civil defense drills and are taught rescue and survival techniques in the aftermath of a nuclear strike.
In the president's own words, it will require all of us to get ready to defend our homes.
Back in Korea, fear is more closely bound with reality. As winter sets in, thousands of GIs and Marines stumble south over land taken just weeks before. Scores more fall into captivity. MacArthur himself draws up a list of nuclear targets stretching from North Korea into China. For this attack, he states he will need 26 nuclear warheads. Considering himself politically hamstrung for not being allowed to bomb north of the Yalu, antagonism between he and Truman grows, leading eventually to his highly publicized firing less than half a year later. Large-scale strategic bombing continues, but the same problems remain. Tremendous destruction is wrought, but enemy movement and supply are only marginally hampered. Early on, many raids on the road network do little to impede the enemy advance. Instead, they take a high toll in friendly forces and among the throngs of refugees fleeing the battle zone. The reason is simple. The Chinese are basically a lightly geared peasant army advancing almost entirely on foot and over land. Most of their supplies are moved at night or by thousands of porters trudging through the countryside. Making matters worse, their transport needs are widely inflated by intelligence officers used to American divisions that consume 600 tons of supplies a day. Chinese divisions get by on 50. Standing just offshore, carriers provide the real means to dig out this kind of enemy. Steaming along in their racetrack courses, round and round a few miles of sea, carriers launch ground attack aircraft in a steady cycle of death. And throughout the war, none is more deadly than the Grumman Panther. During the first 6 months of the conflict, American air superiority reigns unchallenged. But in November 1950, another shockwave jars the Western world. The arrival of an aircraft for which the Panther is no match. And when they begin to chew up the B-29 formations operating there, America looks desperately for an answer. When the first MiG-15 jet fighters appear in the skies over Korea, they display a technological prowess none thought possible of the communist world. The initial 50 MiGs deployed quickly grow to 450, flown mostly by Chinese and Soviet pilots operating from political havens behind the Yalu River. Before war's end, that number nearly doubles. 1 month later, the U.S. response arrives, the Air Force F-86 Sabre. And although chronic shortages mean there are never more than 150 in Korea at any given time, the matter of air superiority is never again in question.
After I had finished my Marine missions flying the F-9s, they had one position they kept for one spot in each Air Force squadron that they kept for a Marine pilot, because the Marines had worked out an arrangement. They wanted to get some of our pilots some air-to-air experience. It was great. It was really a different kind of flying that I've been doing in the Panther, down doing close air support and down trying to dig them out down close to the ground. And this, of course, was flying up 35,000, 40,000 feet.
Tiger lead, Tiger 2 here. I got a couple of movies out there. One coming around at 2.
You didn't stand off like people do today and shoot a missile and it goes out and does your work for you. What you had to get out. You maneuvered him. You went out, you outflew the guy or outmaneuvered him, and you had to get him behind here 500 to 1,000 feet back and hose him, we'd say, with these 50 caliber. And so it was really old World War II type dogfighting, except you're doing it in jets. And so you're going, you have closing speeds, 500, 600 miles an hour on planes going the opposite direction. You're closing maybe 800 to 1,000 miles an hour. And you'd see planes and you'd get into them, and all at once, bang, there you are, you and the guy you're with. And the rest of the air war has gone someplace. Oh, can't even see anybody else in sight.
In the coming years, American pilots display absolute superiority over the men they face. Because in spite of the Russian plane's superb climb rate and turning capability, by war's end, the U.S. Air Force claims a Sabre to MiG kill ratio of just over 10 to 1. But dogfights at 40,000 feet are really just a sideshow to the war on the ground. A war where tensions heighten dramatically once the sun goes down. It is in these hours between dusk and dawn that the Chinese are most likely to attack. Originally intended as a night fighter, the Panther is well suited to operating after sundown. And although that role is eventually co-opted by other aircraft, many Panther missions are carried out at night.
We used to go up with 2 planes and keep them over the front lines, being controlled with a special type Marine Corps ground radar. And we would, they would give a signal to drop, say, 25,000, 30,000 feet. Those were enjoyable flights, from my point of view, because there were very few other people up there in the black of night, because they didn't have a very fine control system. So we were all on our own, and of course with an airplane like that you had the ultimate and trust in, it was enjoyable flying that bird at night.
Returning from these missions and finding their carrier on a vast ocean in the black of night is, as naval aviators say, like finding a postage stamp in a darkened room. And finding it is only half the challenge.
You're going to have to check your lineup all the way down. We still have a flight starboard crosswind. All right, Roger, 112 with a ball, 35 Seaman. Roger, you're looking pretty good right now. You're decelling, a little bit of power, and you're going low. Let's get up on the main ball, you're low. 505 at 800 CU, can I go down to 600? Check your lineup, hold it up, power, power, and check your lineup, hold it up, power, power, power.
Winters off the Korean peninsula are unforgiving. Carriers spend much of their time sailing around the vicious storms that sweep through the Sea of Japan. In this kind of weather, flight operations become nearly impossible, and for pilots, ditching at sea unthinkable. But the real hardship is faced by the GIs and Marines fighting it out ashore. In the face of severe losses, the Marines often refuse to leave their dead behind. Units cut off look to the air for resupply and stubbornly fight on, stalling the Chinese advance. In spite of the weather, UN planes hit the enemy around the clock, buying precious time for reinforcements to arrive. In close air support, Marine and Navy pilots outpace their Air Force counterparts. The Marine ground troops and the men in the air benefit from an organic support system developed over years of cooperation since the island-hopping campaigns of World War II. Many Army commanders openly state their preference for Navy or Marine air support over their Air Force counterparts. Back in the States, a rebuilding of the armed forces is underway. Priorities have been reevaluated since the war began, and in 1952, a new carrier is commissioned. One of many of the new Essex-class designs to come. These are vessels around which the new Navy will be built. And this, the first Essex-class carrier, is proper vindication of the man after which it is named. By 1952, Panthers are flying off the deck of the USS Forrestal. The Navy attempts to update the Panther in hopes of realizing equity with advanced fighters of the day. Enter the Grumman Cougar. It is basically the Panther, with a 40% larger swept wing, and will reach speeds nearly 100 miles an hour faster than its predecessor. Some survived to fly as reconnaissance planes in the war in Vietnam, a war in which the carrier-based ground attack jet will fully realize its devastating potential. But in Korea, the Cougar arrives too late to see action alongside its older sibling. By 1953, as war's end nears, Panthers have flown nearly 78,000 missions. A Navy jet conceived in an era when naval aviation was being given its last rites. The Panther helps enable the Carrier Task Force to outlast its critics and resurrect itself in the waters off of Korea.